The chill of a Roman winter seeped through the walls. Livia Drusilla waited, her hands resting on the swell of her unborn child. 3 days had passed since the command arrived. The most powerful man in the world had seen her and decided she would be his. Now she was to be given, like a vase or a parcel of land, from one husband to another. This was the prelude. The true ceremony began in darkness, with the arrival of women whose faces were as solemn as priests. They were the pro-nubui, the guides through a sacred terror. Their first task was one of erasure. They stripped her of her own clothes, her jewelry, the very identity of Livia. In the lamplight, they bathed her with oils, anointing a vessel for a new purpose. Then, they wrapped her in a tunic of stark white, woven on an ancient loom. At her waist, they tied a complex knot. This was the knot of Hercules, a binding no hand but her new husbands would be permitted to loosen. Next, they took her hair, using not a comb, but the iron-sharp point of a spear. They parted her tresses. The cold metal traced lines across her scalp, a ritual division performed with the weapon of war. Finally, they placed over her head a veil the color of a low flame. Saffron-yellow, it shrouded her face, casting the world in a fiery haze. Thus transformed, she was led into the night. Their destination was a small, ancient temple nestled between the great hills of Rome. Inside, the air was still and heavy with incense. At the center stood the object of their visit, a statue of the god Mutu and Nuas. Augustine, writing centuries later with revulsion, would describe it in precise, horrified detail. It was a representation of the phallus carved to immense, daunting proportions. The ritual was explicit, mandatory, and devoid of metaphor. Livia, guided by the pro-nubui, was required to seat herself upon this effigy. It was an offering, a symbolic surrender of her virginity to the god of fertility, before the physical surrender to her husband. She sat, the cold stone or polished with a shocking contrast to the living warmth of her body. The pro-nubui witnessed it, their silence a form of ratification. When she rose, a transaction was complete. She had been dedicated. The god had claimed his first fruits. She returned to her home, but she was no longer the woman who had left. Dawn broke on a day of public theater, and arrived at the house, their manner purposeful. This was the moment of seizure, a reenactment of Rome's founding crime, the abduction of the Sabine women. Livia knew her role. As the men approached, she turned to her mother and clutched at her. She began to scream, a high, desperate sound. Her mother wailed in response, arms outstretched, fingers grasping at empty air. The men closed in, pulling Livia from the maternal embrace. Her cries were not optional, they were essential to the ritual. To go quietly would curse the union. They lifted her, her feet kicking uselessly, and carried her from the home she was leaving forever. Side, a procession had formed. Doorkeepers, children with baskets of nuts, and a crowd of onlookers lined the route. As they began to move, the singing started. These were the FES-CEN 9 verses, ribald, crude, and graphically explicit. The crowd shouted them directly at the veiled figure of the bride. They sang of the wedding night to come. They described the act of consummation in vivid, joking detail. They speculated on the bride's body, on the groom's prowess, on the blood that would be shed. Livia walked, a flame-colored ghost, through this gauntlet of obscenity. For over an hour, the songs followed her, a public soundtrack to her impending defloration. Somewhere in that crowd walked her former husband, forced by the groom to participate in this humiliation. He heard the songs about the woman who still carried his child. The procession ended at the threshold of Octavian's home. This was not merely a doorstep, it was a legal boundary. On this side, she belonged to her father. On the other, she would belong to her husband, a possession in a category called manus. He could not step over it herself. To stumble would be an omen of disaster. Instead, she was lifted once more, passed like a sacred object over the lintel. Her feet touched the floor of her new domain, and her old life was legally extinguished. Inside, the feast commenced. She was made to sit in Octavian's lap, a living symbol of his acquisition. Food and wine flowed for hours, but when the feast ended, the guests did not depart. They followed as she was led to the bridal chamber. The door closed behind her and her new husband. Outside, the guests settled in for the night. They brought torches, flutes, and their voices. They began to sing the EP of Alamea, wedding songs that were encouragements and running commentaries. They listened intently at the door for sounds from within, a sigh, a cry, any evidence that the ritual was progressing. The vigil would last until dawn, turning the most intimate act into a communal performance. The marriage was not considered consummated until it was publicly witnessed. 3 centuries later, in a different Rome, another bride prepared. Poppaeis Abina, famed for her beauty, was to marry the Emperor Nero. She was no frightened girl, she was a seasoned player who had schemed for this moment. She knew the rituals by heart. She had already endured the pronubui, the temple, the seizure. Now, she would endure them again for the most dangerous man in the world. The same stripping, bathing, and spearing of the hair, the same journey to a temple, the same act of sitting upon the god, the same simulated abduction from her household, her cries echoing in a different atrium, the same procession through streets where the FESCEN9 verses now carried an edge of fear, for the groom was a matriarch, the same crossing of a threshold into absolute, terrifying power, the same feast, the same lot minus sitting, the same escort to a bedchamber. Outside this door, the listeners were not just friends and family. They were senators, generals, the elite of the empire, singing their songs while straining to hear the sounds of their emperor taking his bride. Poppaea had won everything she wanted. 3 years later, Nero, in a fit of rage, would kick her to death while she was pregnant. The legal power of Manus had its ultimate expression. Her beauty and her idol were no armor against the husband who owned her. In a small house in Pompeii, a third woman made her preparations. Her name was Caesarea Prima. He was 20-2. Her wedding would be ordinary. Her groom, not an emperor but a local man. The artifacts of her life were mundane, a simple fastenum amulet shaped like a phallus for protection, a belt for the Hercules knot, a veil dyed with precious saffron. She would have experienced the rituals with the same visceral reality as Livia and Poppaea. The pro-nubile hands, the chill of the temple statue, the wrenching pull from her mother, the crude songs, the weightless moment of being carried over the threshold. Then, in August of 79 AD, Vesuvius erupted. The ash fell like gray snow, burying her home, her wedding belongings, the entire city in a perfect, silent tomb. It preserved her world, freezing the ordinary objects of an ordinary Roman bride in time. For we know her name from an inscription. We know her age. We know she was on the cusp of marriage. The volcano preserved the evidence of what that meant. Centuries rolled on. The empire Christianized. A bishop named Augustine walked the streets of Rome. An old temple still stood. He entered one and saw, with a theologian's disgust, the statue of Moto in US to NUS. He wrote of it with deliberate, shocking clarity, so that all would know the shameful practices Christianity had abolished. He described the brides, the ritual seating, the monstrous proportions. His condemnation, and that of lactantus and Darnabias, was a weapon meant to destroy paganism, and their zeal to erase, accidentally preserved. The Romans themselves saw no need to minutely document what everyone knew. The Church Fathers, in their horror, provided the manual. They recorded the very acts they wished to make unthinkable. Thus, the historical record was etched in disgust. The temples were torn down. The statues were smashed. The rituals were outlawed. But ghosts of the ceremonies lingered, transformed. The bride's veil remained, though its color faded from saffron to white. The carrying across the threshold became a gesture of romance, its origin as a legal transfer forgotten. The best man evolved from the accomplice in the ritual kidnapping. The ring found its home on the fourth finger, following the Roman belief in the vena amoris, the vein of love running straight to the heart. June remained the favored month for weddings, sacred to Juno, the goddess of marriage. The dark core was removed, the hollow shell of tradition remained. Livia's story unfolded into power and legend. She never bore Augustus children, a fact that may have been her strategy. He navigated the deadly politics of the palace for over 50 years, becoming the formidable Empress Livia, mother to the next emperor. She died at 80-6, having mastered the world that began by mastering her. Is story ended abruptly in violence and a grotesque postscript. Nero, after her death, found a young freedman who resembled her. He had the boy castrated, dressed him in Papa Ea's clothes, and married him in a public ceremony, a ghostly echo of the rituals that had bound her. Kezia Prima's story has no ending. The ash preserved her name, her age, her context, but not her fate. She is a cipher for the millions of anonymous Roman brides. They sat on the stone god. They screamed as they were dragged away. They walked through the singing mob. They were carried into a life of legal non-existence. They lived and died, leaving no trace but the collective memory of the rituals they endured. The temple is dust. The statues are fragments in museums. The laws of Manus are obsolete, but when a bride is veiled, when she is lifted over a threshold, when a ring is placed on her finger in June, the faintest echo of a darker, more visceral world whispers through the ages. It was not a metaphor. It was not a symbol. It was the physical, public, and legally sanctioned journey of a woman from one man's possession to another's, blessed by gods who demanded a tangible proof of devotion. The women came by night to prepare the sacrifice. The men came by day to enact the theft, and the city itself gathered to sing it all into being. The silence before the ritual was a palpable thing. It clung to the whitewashed walls of the bride's home, thick and expectant. Outside Rome slept, but inside the air hummed with a sacred tension. The pro-nubili entered not as friends, but as functionaries of fate. Their footsteps were soft, yet each one seemed to echo in the hushed atrium. They carried with them the weight of generations' soils and clay jars, combs of bone, a length of pristine wool. Their eyes, in the flickering lamplight, held no comfort, only a solemn certainty. This was a transformation, and all transformation requires a breaking. The first breaking was of self. Livia stood, a young woman heavy with child, and let them undo her. Things were drawn from her hair, letting it fall in a dark cascade. The bracelets were slipped from her wrists, the rings from her fingers. The layers of her stole were unfastened and peeled away, each fold releasing the scent of her own life, sunlight and spice and home. She was rendered naked, not just in body, but in identity. The girl, the daughter, the wife of Tiberius Claudius Nero, ceased to exist in that lamplit circle. She was merely a form, waiting to be inscribed with new meaning. The bath was a baptism into this unknown state. The oils they smoothed over her skin were old and fragrant, smelling of myrrh and distant forests. Their hands moved with impersonal efficiency, anointing shoulders, back the curve of her pregnant belly. They spoke low words, invocations to Juno, to Tellus, to the shadowy gods of the threshold and the bedchamber. Livia closed her eyes. The child within her stirred, a private protest against the public ceremony. Next came the weaving of a new skin. The tunica recta was not simply a dress. It was a tapestry of tradition, its threads spun and woven on an upright loom, a technology preserved from the time of the ancestors. As they pulled the white garment over her head, it was as if they were clothing her in history itself. Fabric was coarse against her oiled skin, a tactile reminder of a simpler, sterner past. Then the belt, a length of woven cord, dyed to red. They wrapped it twice around her waist and began the knot. This was the knot as Herculenas, the knot of Hercules. Their fingers flew in a complex dance, looping and pulling, creating a puzzle of fabric. It was a seal, a legal and spiritual lock for which only one key existed: the will of the man who would soon be her husband. Until he chose to untie it, she was bound, a parcel tied shut. The sparing of her hair was the most visceral ritual yet. One of the matrons produced not a comb, but an object that made Livia's breath catch. The Hastacalibar is the bachelor's spear. Its iron point, though likely dulled, was unmistakably a weapon. The matron gathered a section of Livia's hair, placed the cold metal flat against her scalp, and drew it downward with firm pressure. The sensation was not of pain, but of profound violation. The spear, an instrument of war and male dominion, was used to partition her femininity, to divide her dresses into the 6 sexy lines. Each pass of the metal was a silent declaration your body is now a territory to be mapped and claimed. Finally, the veil. It was not a wisp of gauze, but a substantial mantle of saffron minus yellow, the color of a dying flame or ripe wheat. Its hue was costly, rare, demanding. As they draped it over her intricately arranged hair, the world melted into a golden haze. The light from the lamp softened. Faces became blurred shapes. Sounds were muffled. She was enclosed in a portable sanctum, isolated within the very ceremony that displayed her. Thus shrouded, she was led out into the sleeping city. Their little procession was a pocket of moving light in the vast Roman dark. The destination was a temple so ancient it seemed to grow from the bedrock of the Palatine Hill. It was a modest structure, lacking the grand columns of the Capitoline temples. It smelled of damp stone and old incense. The pro-nubile guided her inside, their hands firm on her elbows. The statue stood in the center of the small cellar. Augustine's words would later fail to capture its imposing, unsettling presence. It was not art, it was potency made manifest. Carved from dark wood, polished by time and countless aerified touches, it rose from the floor in a blunt, undeniable curve. The proportions were, as the bishop would sputter, monstrous, a deliberate exaggeration meant to awe, to intimidate, to embody a force of nature. This was Mutu Nus, the god of the threshold, the guardian of the marriage bed, the bestower of fertility. The ritual was wordless. The pro-nubile positioned her before it. There was no altar to kneel at, only this singular, confronting form. Their instructions were clear, transmitted through pressure on her shoulders. She was to offer herself, not in spirit, but in physical simulation. Livia, her body taut with pregnancy, gathered the coarse white fabric of her tunic. With the matrons as witnesses, she lowered herself onto the cold, smooth wood of the god. The contact was a shock, a blasphemy that was also a prayer. Though the position, the veil hiding her face, hiding her shame or her resolve. In that moment, she was not Livia. She was every bride, making a pragmatic pact with divine power. She was surrendering the abstract concept of her virginity to stone and myth, so that the mortal man who awaited her might find her fruitful. It was a transaction of the flesh, sanctioned by eternity. When she rose, a shift had occurred. She had been consecrated. She belonged, in some esoteric way, to this silent wooden god before she could belong to Octavian. The walk back was quieter. The deed was done. Dawn, when it came, was not a relief. It was the precursor to a different kind of performance. With the first light, the men arrived. Their energy was opposite to the nocturnal solemnity of the pro-nubile. It was boisterous, charged with a latent aggression sanctioned by tradition. This was the raptus, the seizure, the living echo of Romulus Escam and to steal the Sabine women. Olivia stood with her mother. The older woman's face was a mask of pre-scripted grief. The men friends of Octavian, strangers, perhaps even her own resigned fathers, urged into the atrium. Their role was to take, hers was to resist. As hands reached for her, she turned and clung to her mother's neck, a gesture at once instinctual and required. "No," she cried, and the sound was perfect in its desperation. It was not a shriek of fear, but the formal cry of the matronales pud, or the matronly modesty, being torn away. Her mother's wail answered hers, a duet of loss. "Ah, my child, do not take her." The men's hands closed on Olivia's arms, her waist. They pulled, not with brutal force, but with inexorable purpose. Her fingers, clutching her mother's stole, were pried loose one by one. The separation was a small, brutal drama played out in the heart of the home. As they lifted her clear of the floor, her mother sank to her knees, arms outstretched toward the empty space where her daughter had been. The performance was complete and terrifyingly real. Outside, Rome was now awake and waiting. The procession assembled, like a small army on the move. At its front, torchbearers held aloft flames that paled in the morning sun. Children darted about, scattering walnuts and sweetmeats, tokens for fertility, trampled underfoot. And then, the air itself seemed to thicken with the rising chant of the FES-CEN9 verses. The songs did not begin politely. They erupted, crude and robust, from the throats of the crowd lining the streets. They were not about love. They were about the mechanics of sex, described with agricultural and architectural metaphor, with soldierly bluntness. "See how the gate awaits the battering ram," one voice shouted. "Heath a plow find fertile soil and the seed take deep root," find another. Joke's worm ate about the knot at her waist, about the spear that had parted her hair, about the sword that would now find its sheath. The verses were a public dissection of the privacy she was about to lose. Livia walked, a flame-minus-colored island in a sea of leering faces and drawling voices. The veil was now a mercy, hiding the heat in her cheeks, the tears of fury or humiliation that might have escaped. She was a spectacle, and the spectacle required her as island endurance. Somewhere in that throng, Tiberius Claudius Nero walked. He heard the vulgar songs about the woman whose body he knew intimately, who carried his son. He was a ghost at his own life's funeral, compelled to witness the triumph of the man who had erased him. The procession wound through the winding streets, a noisy, garish snake. Finally, it coiled to a halt before the grand house of Gaius Octavianus. The threshold was more than wooden stone. It was a line drawn across the map of a life. Before it, she was under her father's potest as. Beyond it, she would be in her husband's manus. She could not cross it under her own power. To do so would be to assume a choice she did not legally possess. So again, hands lifted her. She was weightless for a moment, suspended between worlds. Then she was across, her sandals touching the polished floor of the vestibule. The legal deed was done. She was now mater familias of this house, and yet its most significant piece of property. The day dissolved into the feast. She was placed on Octavian Ness' lap, a living emblem of his conquest. The wine flowed. The jokes continued, though inside the house they were perhaps more refined. She ate little. The child within her was a quiet, persistent reminder of a past this ceremony was trying desperately to overwrite. As evening drew in, the atmosphere shifted once more. The feast ended not with departure, but with a quiet migration. Frau Nubai reappeared. They led her away from the laughter and the lamplight, down a corridor to a small chamber. The lectus genialis, the marriage bed, was draped in fine linens. Fertility charms, figs, dates, another small fastenum amulet lay upon the pillow. They helped her remove her saffron veil, the first time her face had been fully uncovered since the previous night. They may have offered final whispered advice, and they left, closing the door. She was alone in the quiet. Soon, the door opened again. Octavian entered. Outside, the silence was abruptly broken. The guests had not gone home. They had gathered outside the chamber door. But they began to sing again the Epieth Alamia. These were not the raucous street songs, but structured hymns. Yet their purpose was the same: to encourage, to witness, to sanctify through noise. Hymen, O Hymenaeus, they chanted. Up in the dark room, do you see how your bride awaits you? They listened, ears pressed to the wood, for the sounds that would signal the completion of the contract. The rustle of cloth, the creak of the bed, a sigh, a cry. Their singing would swell at any hint, a communal celebration of a private act. They would stay there, taking turns, through the long night. Their presence was a wall of sound, ensuring there was no true intimacy, only a publicly mine-assaudited consummation. At dawn the singing would cease. Olivia would emerge changed. The rituals were over. The life of a Roman wife had begun. For Poppy e Sabina, a century later, the rituals were a calculated price. She knew the script. As the pro Nuba prepared her for Nero, her mind was not on the god in the temple, but on the throne in the palace. When she sat upon the statue of Mutu, NUS, it was a political maneuver, a necessary step to secure divinity of a different kind. When she screamed as she was seized from her mother, it was with the practice pitch of an actress. When she endured the FESCEN9 verses, she heard beneath them the whispers of senators already plotting for or against her. Her procession was a coronation march in disguise. Her threshold crossing led into the heart of absolute, capricious power. The guests outside her bridal chamber were the most powerful men in the world, and their songs were pledges of allegiance as much as wedding hymns. She had traded one set of bindings for another, believing the imperial purple to be softer than the wool of the Natus Herculanus. For Caesarea Prima of Pompey, the rituals were simply life. Her fast inum amulet was cheap pottery, not gold. Her saffron veil was perhaps borrowed. Her procession would have wound through narrow, dusty streets, not the sacred way. The guests outside heard, or would have been neighbors, potters, and bakers. But the essentials were identical: the cold temple statue, the wrenching farewell, the crude songs, the silent crossing into a new dominion. Then the mountain breathed its fire and dash. It froze her world, preserving her wedding chest, her cosmetics, the carbonized loaf of bread that might have been part of her feast. It preserved the ordinary reality of the extraordinary ordeal. Augustine, walking through a Christian Rome, saw the hollowed Minos at temple and the broken statue. He saw the remnant of a world he despised, and describing it with such vivid horror, he sought to bury it forever. Instead, he etched it into memory. He preserved the very image. He wanted to destroy the young woman, failed in fire minus gold, lowering herself in solemn duty onto the cold embodiment of an old god's power. The stone is gone, the laws are gone, but the ghost of the ritual lingers in the soft whisper of a modern veil, in the playful lift across a threshold, in the solemn exchange of a ring. We have kept the shells, long after forgetting the strange, fierce, and terrifying creatures that once lived inside. She awoke to a world remade by fire. The air was not air, but grit. It scratched her through with each shallow breath, a dry, suffocating shroud. Daylight, once a clean gold, was now as sulphurous, oppressive bronze, staining everything it touched. Caesarea Prima sat up on her simple bed, the wool blanket rough against her skin. The first sound was not the expected cry of vendors or the clatter of cart wheels from the street below. It was a low, rolling grumble, like a sleeping giant turning over in the earth beneath their feet. Then came the rain, not of water, but of small porous stones, pattering on the tiled roof with a sound like 1,000 tiny bones falling from the sky. Hummus. The rituals of the day before the anxious consultations with her mother, the final fitting of the tunic erecta hanging on a peg, the careful wrapping of the saffron veil seems on a play performed in another lifetime. Today was to have been the procession. Today, the men would have come. Today, she would have screamed the ritual scream, clung to her mother's ritual grip, and been carried toward a new life. Now, the world was ending, and her wedding with it. He rose, her movements automatic. In the dim, eerie light, she walked to the wooden chest in the corner. Her fingers, trembling slightly, found the familiar latch and lifted it. Inside, folded with care, lay the fabric of her future. She lifted the white tunic, feeling the coarse, honest weave of the upright loom. It was heavier than she remembered. Beneath it lay the belt, dyed a deep madder reed. She did not touch the knot, already perfectly tied in its complex Hercules pattern. Next, the small, painted terracotta fastenum. Its protective, phallic shape felt cool and solid in her palm. A charm against the evil eye, meant to guard her on her journey to the bridal chamber. Now, she clutched it as a charm against the falling sky. From outside, the sounds escalated, not the festive songs of a wedding crowd, but the chaotic symphony of panic. Shouts, distant and distorted, were swallowed by the relentless hiss of falling ash. A thud against the outer wall made her jump. A larger rock. Her mother appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of soot minus streaked terror. "We must go to the harbor," she said, her voice cracking. "Your father says the boats." But Caesarea shook her head. A slow, decisive movement. The harbor was a chaos of bodies, a seething mass of desperation she could already imagine. Here in this room was order. Here was the path she had been prepared to walk. "Not yet," she said, and her voice was calmer than she felt. She slipped the tunic over her dress. The ceremonial wool scraped against the finer linen beneath, a layer of sacred duty over mortal fear. She cinched the red belt around her waist, the knot resting just below her navel, a sealed promise. She threaded a leather cord through the hole in the fasten and tied it around her neck. The amulet lay against her breastbone, a small, hard weight. Finally, she lifted the saffron veil. It was the most precious thing she owned, its color purchased with a month's worth of her father's earnings. It smelled of the dive and of hope. She did not drape it over her elaborate wedding hairstyle, for her hair was still loose and wild. Instead, she wrapped it around her head and shoulders, a cocoon of what was supposed to be. Thus clad in the garments of a bride, she walked out of her room. The atrium was a scene from a nightmare. The impluvium, the central pool meant to catch rainwater, was filling with gray, granular sludge. The beautiful frescoes on the walls, garden scenes with birds and flowers, were already disappearing under a monochrome film. Her father stood by the front door, peering out into the sepia gloom, a cloak pulled over his head. He turned as she entered, and his eyes widened. He saw not his daughter, but a phantom from a cancelled ceremony, a yellow-shrouded apparition in the ash-storm. "Hey, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion and dread. "I am ready," she said simply. It was not an answer to his question. It was a statement of fact. She was ready for the procession, for the threshold. Since the world insisted on chaos, she would insist on form. Since the future was collapsing into hot dust, she would wear the uniform of a future that had been promised. A tremendous crash shook the house, raining plaster from the ceiling. Part of the roof over the garden had given way. The sound was beyond thunder. It was the mountain itself, clearing its throat. "There is no time for this," her mother wept, grabbing at her arm. "Take that off." But Kia pulled away, the saffron fabric slipping through her mother's soot-stained fingers. "I will meet him," she said, her eyes fixed on the swirling chaos beyond the door. A betrothed, a baker's son named Marcus, lived 6 streets away. In the wedding plan, the procession would have snaked through those very streets, past the Fuller Y, the tavern, the shrine to the Loris. And now, she would walk them alone. Her father, pragmatic to the last, saw the futile determination in her eyes and surrendered to it. Perhaps he saw in her bridal dress a kind of magic, a protective ritual as valid as any prayer to the gods. "Stay behind me," he coughed, pulling the door open. The world outside was an inversion of everything she knew. The wedding procession should have been a river of light and sound through clear air. This was a stumbling, blind crawl through a hot, dark blizzard. The ash was not like snow, it was weighty, insistent. It coated her veil immediately, turning the brilliant yellow to a dirty ochre. The pumice stones bruised her shoulders through the wool. She held the veil closed over her nose and mouth, but the fine particles seeped through, gritting on her teeth. They did not walk so much as wade. The ash was already ankle-steep, mounting in drifts against doorways. Shapes loomed and faded in the gloom, other fleeing citizens, hunched and ghost-like. A mule cart, abandoned, its driver gone. The sounds were muffled, as if heard through a thick wool blanket, a child's wail, a man shouting a name that was swallowed by the roar, the constant, sinister hiss of the fallout. She did not know if she was going the right way. Landmarks had dissolved. The column that marked the intersection was just a darker smudge in the gray. The shrine was a vague shape buried to its knees. Her father lead, his sense of direction battling the disorienting, uniform chaos. He was leading her to the marina, not to Marcus's house. Survival, not ritual, was his liturgy now. But Kia's feet, inside their simple wedding sandals, began to drag. She stopped at a corner where a low wall was barely visible. This was where the FESCEN9 singers should have been, their lewd jokes echoing off the plaster. Here the crowd should have jostled for a view of the flame-colored bride. Now, it was only the suffocating, particulate wind. She lifted a hand, clad in her ritual garb, and placed it on the ash-covered stone. It was a mute salute to the celebration that would not be. "Kia, come on," her father barked, his fear sharpening his voice. A new sound cut through the low rumble, faster, higher, pitched roar like a river in flood. It came from behind them, From the direction of the mountain, a wave of superheated gas and ash, a pyroclastic surge, racing down the slopes at impossible speed. It was a wall of death, invisible in the murk, but announced by its terrifying voice. Her father heard it too, the colored rain from his ash-coated face. He knew that sound meant no harbor, no boat, no escape. His eyes darted, finding the deep doorway of a stone-built warehouse across the street. There, now. He grabbed her arm, the one not weighted down by her bridal chest, and pulled. They stumbled through the deepening ash which now reached her calves. It was like running in wet sand. The roaring grew louder, a beast closing in. They fell into the doorway, a shallow recess of relative shelter. He pushed her against the inner door, a sturdy slab of oak, and threw his body over hers, his cloak tenting over both of them. In the last second, in the deafening, onrushing roar, Kezia did not pray to Jupiter or plead to Vulcan. Her hand flew to the fass, and at her throat. Her fingers closed around the Terataka phallus, the symbol of fertility, of protection, of a husband's potent claim. She squeezed it so hard, she feared it would shatter. Then the heat arrived. It was not like fire. It was an instant, dry cooking. The air was stolen from her lungs, replaced by a scorching blast that seared her throat. The wool of her tunic and veil did not, it simply became unbearably hot, a second skin of agony. The roar was inside her skull, the world dissolving into pure, violent sensation. It lasted only moments. Then, silence. A profound, absolute silence, heavier than the ash. The heat lingered, then began to fade, replaced by a deep, baking warmth. Her father's weight on her was immense, and utterly still. She tried to move, to breathe. The air was thick with a fine, choking dust. She pushed, and his body slumped to the side, into the ash that now filled the doorway to mid-chest level. Kezia Prima stirred, buried but alive in a stone pocket. She coughed, a ragged, painful sound that expelled ash. Every inch of her skin felt scalded. Her veil was fused in places to her hair by the heat. Slowly, painfully, she shifted in the confined space. The oak door behind her was hot to the touch. The world beyond their shallow shelter was gone, buried under many feet of steaming volcanic material. In the darkened, the quiet, she began the slow work of digging, not with her hands, but with the mere act of breathing, of existing. Hours passed, marked only by the gradual cooling of the air around her. The ash settled, compacting under its own weight. Eventually, a strange calm descended. The mountain's violence had passed. The world was entombed, and in that tomb, a bride waited. Her fingers found the red belt at her waist, the nodus her siulanus. In the absolute blackness, she traced the complex loops and weaves. The knot her husband was meant to untie. She thought of Marcus, the baker's son with flour in his eyebrows. Had he run? Had he made it to a boat? Had he been caught in the open, like so many others? She would never know. Her other hand found the fastenum again. Its shape was familiar, a comfort in the formless dark, a protector in the bedchamber. Her body slowly cooling in a tomb of ash. Her spirit, time lost meaning. Thirst became a sharp, defining pain. The air, though cooler, was still foul. She drifted in undoubt of a feverish consciousness. In her mind, the rituals played out, but twisted. The prone Nubui had faces of ash. The statue of Mutu Nus was made of hot rock. The procession marched through endless gray, with no songs, only the hiss of falling cinders. When the end came, it was not with drama, but with a gentle fading. Her breaths grew further apart, shallow sips of dusty air. The weight on her chest was immense, but it was no longer just the ash, it was the weight of the unmade future, of the unwalked procession, of the songless wedding night. Her last conscious sensation was the feel of the rough-spun white wool against her skin, and the smooth, cool terataka of the amulet in her palm. She died as she had lived that final day Betrith prepared, and waiting at the threshold. Centuries later, an archaeologist's trowel would carefully brush away the volcanic stone, It would reveal not a skeleton in a panic-stricken pose, but one curled with a strange formality. The bones would be fragile, but around them would be hints of fabric-ate race of reddish pigment. Near the waist, a dusting of unusual yellow ochre near the skull. Among the ribs, a small fired-clay object would be found, a phallic amulet, a fascinum. Her name, known from a separate inscription found in the house's ruins, would be given to this silent figure Kia Prima. She became the eternal bride of Pompeii, not a bride of a man, but a bride of the volcano. Her ritual was not of marriage, but of cessation. Her procession was through the streets of oblivion. Her bridal chamber was a cocoon of ash, and Hurst Ori, preserved in the very sediments that killed her, tells a truth far deeper than any historical account of Livia or Pompeii. It tells us that for every woman whose wedding was a grand political tool, there were 10,000 whose weddings were simple, profound hopes. It tells us that the rituals were not just about power or possession, but about the human need to mark transformation with symbol, especially when the world is ending. The ash preserved her final choice to face the cataclysm not in fleeing terror, but in the dignified costume of a life about to begin. She was not a pawn of emperors. She was a woman who put on her wedding clothes to meet her fate, and in doing so, she wore the whole weight of Roman womanhood, its expectations, its vulnerabilities, its quiet, fierce dignity into the dark. The tremor that morning was different. It wasn't the familiar, deep grumble that shifted roof tiles and rattled cups. This was a sharp, vertical jolt, as if the world had been struck from below by a colossal hammer. Harkus, the baker's son, froze, his hands buried in a trough of flour. The dough, a living, breathing thing a moment before, went still. In the sudden silence that followed the shake, he heard it, a sound like 1,000 trees being torn from the earth all at once. It came from the north, from the mountain that had always been a gentle, fine-covered giant on the horizon. He didn't think. He ran. He ran past his father, who was staring dumbfounded at a crack that had snaked up the wall of the oven. He ran into the street, which was already filling with a fine gray mist. Not mist, ash. It fell like a silent, malevolent snow. People were emerging from doorways, their faces tipped upward, expressions blank with disbelief. Cass's feet knew the way. 6 streets. Past the Fuller Y with its pungent smell of urine, now masked by the acrid scent of cinders. Past the tavern where the morning drinkers were now stumbling outside, cups forgotten. His mind was a single, bright point of purpose. Kia. Their wedding was tomorrow. He had seen the saffron veil at the dyer's shop last week, a bolt of captured sunlight. He had practiced the words he would say when he took her hand from her father's. He had even endured the jokes of his friends about the FESCEN 9 verses they would shout. None of that mattered now. Only the 6 streets. A second surge hit when he was halfway there. This was not a tremor. This was the mountain exhaling. A hot, roaring wind blasted down the narrow street, carrying not just ash, but a blizzard of pumice stones. They hailed down on the tile roofs with a deafening clatter, bounced into the cobblestones, struck shoulders, arms up, flinching as a fist-sized rock shattered a potted plant beside him. The world dimmed, the bronze light of minutes before swallowed by a churning, gray-brown twilight. He pushed on, squinting against the sting. The ash was thickening, coating everything. It was in his mouth, gritty between his teeth. He passed the small shrine to the Lares, the household gods. Their little stone faces were already half-buried, gazing out impassively at the end of the world they were supposed to protect. Ahead, a shape resolved from the gloom. Kia's house. The door was open. His heart, already pounding from the run, ceased. Had they fled? Had they left without him? Kia, he shouted, his voice hoarse and swallowed by the falling roar. He staggered into the atrium. The impouvia was a bowl of gray slurry. Kia, Lucius, Octavia. No answer. The house had the hollow, abandoned feel of a tomb. He checked the main rooms, the kitchen, his footsteps leaving dark prints in the ever-thickening dust. In her room, he stopped. There, on the floor by her simple bed, lay a single object, a leather sandal, a woman's sandal, not tossed aside in panic, but placed neatly, as if ready to be stepped into. He knelt, picking it up. It was still faintly warm from the heated air. They had been here. They had left in haste, but not without thought. He turned it over in his hands, the ordinary leather suddenly the most significant artifact in the world. Where? The Forum, the marina. The city gates were a chaos. He had seen the crush of bodies surging towards them. The marina would be worse, a seething mass of terror fighting for too few boats. Then, his eyes caught a disturbance in the ash near the doorway to the street. Not just the random fall. A pattern. A scuffle. A drag mark. Leading out. He dropped the sandal and ran back into the hell of the street. The ash was deeper now, over his ankles. The falling pumice had lessened, but the air was hotter, harder to breathe. He followed the vague trail, a series of depressions already softening at the edges as new ash filled them. They turned a corner, away from the main thoroughfare to the marina, towards a district of warehouses and granaries. His hope, a fragile, fluttering thing, sparked. Her father, Lucius, was a practical man. He wouldn't have joined the mindless herd heading for the water. He would have sought solid shelter, stone walls, a chance to wait out the storm. The trail ended at a deep doorway set into a massive stone wall, the warehouse of Popedius Secundus. The oak door was shut fast, likely barred from within. But, in the doorway itself, the ash was mounted high, strangely shaped. Marcus's breath caught. He rushed forward, his hands digging frantically, heedless of the heat still radiating from the stone. His fingers brushed wool, coarse white wool, then a flash of dirty yellow. His hands worked faster, scraping, pulling. The ash gave way, revealing a fold of fabric, then another. It was a tunica erecta, the wedding tunic. Wrapped over it, a mantle of saffron, now the color of mud and soot. He was digging out a ghost. Then he found the arm, the hand, clutched in the fingers, so tight they had to be pried apart after the centuries, was a small terracotta fastenum, the bride's protective amulet. His vision blurred. From ash or tears he couldn't tell. He followed the line of the arm, up to the shoulder, to where the body was curled fetal, protected by the larger form that had slumped over at Lucius, his back to the world, a final shield. Marcus did not scream. The sound that left him was a low, animal groan, torn from a place deeper than grief. He had found her. Not at the altar, smiling beneath her veil. Not in their new home by the hearth. Here, in a tomb of hot ash dressed for a wedding that would never be. He crouched there in that doorway as the world died around him. The pyroclastic surge that had killed them had passed, but the mountain was not finished. The air grew thicker, hotter. The ashfall intensified, a relentless, smothering blanket. He knew he should move. He should run, find shelter, fight for his life. But the will had left him. The 6 streets had led here to this. The future was under his hands, cold and still. Gently, with the tenderness he had saved for their wedding night, he rearranged the saffron veil over where her face would be. He covered her hand and the amulet it held with his own for a moment. Then, he did the only thing left to do. He sat down beside her in the doorway, his back against the jamb, shoulder minus to minus shoulder with the father who had tried to save her. He pulled the edge of her white tunic over his own knees. He would not leave her to face the final, dark descent alone. If this was the threshold, he would cross it with her. The historian's trowel would find him 2 centuries later. A young man, seated in a doorway, his body turned not in flight, but towards the 2 shapes curled within. His bones would tell no dramatic story of struggle or escape. They would tell a story of arrival, and of staying. The narrative of K's Ia Prima is not complete without Marcus. It is not just a story of a bride preserved, but of a groom who arrived too late for the ceremony, yet in time for the vow that matters most. I will not leave you. His journey through the 6 streets of Pompey that day was the truest Roman wedding procession. It contained the urgency of the seizure, the determination of the procession, and a final, terrible crossing of a threshold. He came to claim his bride, and he found her in the arms of death, so he claimed his place beside her. While Levy's wedding was a transaction of power, and Papa Eis a gambit for a throne, the wedding of Kazai and Marcus was this: a young man fighting through a rain of fire to reach a young woman who had dressed in hope, and then choosing to share her fate in the ashes. It is the most silent, most devastating wedding ritual of all. The ash did not just preserve a victim. It preserved a love story, interrupted at the very moment it was meant to begin, frozen in a posture of eternal, quiet companionship. The fastenum in her hand, meant to guard their fertile future, became a seal on their shared tomb. And in that, they tell us something the grand histories often forget. For a woman was a symbol of state, or a prize for an emperor, she was someone's Kazai. For a ritual was a political tool, it was a personal help. And sometimes, the most profound act of meanness of taking into one's hand was not an act of possession, but an act of staying when all the world was running away. The pronouncements of emperors crumble into rhetoric. The edicts of senators dissolve into forgotten scrolls. But the silence of the ash holds a longer, deeper truth. We sift through history looking for grand narratives: the rise of empires, the fall of dynasties, the clash of armies. We chronicle the deeds of men who shaped the world with sword and law. Yet beneath the marble and the monumental prose, there is another story. It is written not in ink, but in fine, gray powder. It is told not by senators, but by the unspoken choices of ordinary people on an extraordinary day. The discovery of the 3 forms in the doorway of the Papadise warehouse did not make the histories. No chronicler recorded the name of Marcus, the baker's son. No poet composed an elegy for Kazai Prima, the bride of ash. Their story was not one of power, but of pathos, not of destiny, but of decision. Let us linger in that doorway a moment longer, not as archaeologists, but as witnesses to the final silent ritual. Marcus did not find a scene of terror. He found a scene of heartbreaking order. The father, Lucius, had positioned himself with the precise, protective instinct of a soldier forming a shield wall. His body was angled to take the full, scorching brunt of the surge, his cloak stretched as a pathetic, final canopy over his daughter. In his last second, he was not a citizen fleeing chaos, he was a paterfamilias defending his own. It was the ultimate enactment of his role. And Kazai, she was not curled in a frantic ball. Her position was curled, yes, but it was the curl of someone settling into wait. The donning of the tunic, erect in the veil, was not the act of a mind unhinged by panic. It was a conscious assertion of identity in the face of oblivion. When the world ceased to make sense, she reached for the script she knew. If she could not be a bride in the house of her husband, she would be a bride in the house of the mountain. Her ritual was complete, even if the world's part in it was not. Then Marcus arrived. He sees the truth in the doorway. His journey ends not with a rescue, but with a recognition. All the rituals he had anticipated, the giving of vows, the joining of hands, the leading of her to his home, were now impossible. Only one ritual remained available to him: the ritual of presence, the ritual of shared fate, a sitting down beside her by drawing the hem of her wedding tunic over his legs. He performed a marriage rite more profound than any dictated by pontifex or law. He declared, in the only way left to him, that her people were now his people. Her end would be his end. In Roman terms, he entered her familia in its final, most absolute moment. He crossed the ultimate threshold to be with her. This is what the ash tells us. Beyond the politics of Livia, beyond the brutal theater of Papa Eis' marriage to Nero, there existed this other Rome, a Rome of bakers and their sons, of young women who saved for saffron veils, of fathers who died as human bulwarks, a Rome where the most important laws were not those engraved on bronze in the Forum, but those engraved on the heart: duty, love, fidelity unto death. The volcanic surge did not just preserve bodies, it preserved character. It froze people in the final, unguarded articulation of who they were. The man with his keys, still trying to unlock a door that lead nowhere. The slave curled around a child not his own. The wealthy woman clasping her jewels, and the dog leashed to its master's wrist. And in a doorway, A family, a father, a daughter, and the young man who chose to join them. Augustine wrote to condemn, to draw a stark moral line between the light of Christianity and the dark of paganism. He saw the statue of Mutu and Estatu and and recoiled at its explicit physicality. But here, in the ash, is a different testament. It speaks not of gods demanding symbolic defloration, but of humans demanding dignity in the face of annihilation. Kay's Aya's grasp on her asanam was as sincere as any bride's ritual seating. It was her plea, her anchor, her last connection to a future of safety and fruitfulness. The mountain, in its awful impartiality, recorded both versions of Rome side by side. The Rome of grand coercive public spectacles, the weddings of state that were about power and possession, and the Rome of intimate, private vows, the quiet promise of a baker's son to a girl in a yellow veil, a promise he kept in the most devastating way imaginable. Though we look to history for lessons in power, and we find them, but if we look to the ash, we find lessons in humanity. We learn that tradition is not just a cage, it can also be armor, a script to cling to when the world loses its plot. We learn that love is not always a celebration, sometimes it is a decision to sit down in a doorway during a firestorm. We learn that the strongest bonds are often the quietest, and they leave the faintest traces asinal left behind, a body position just so a shared space in the sediment. Thumpy is not merely a city frozen in time. It is a gallery of final choices. And gallery, the quiet tableau in the warehouse doorway, is perhaps the most eloquent. It contains no emperor, no empress, no famous general. It contains only the raw materials of a life about to be built, and the solemn, terrible vow to honor that potential, even in death. So when we think of Roman weddings, let us remember not only the politically orchestrated transfer of Livia, or the deadly imperial union of Papa Ea. Let us remember the wedding that never was, on a day when the sky fell. Let us remember the bride who dressed for it anyway, and the groom who came for her, and the threshold they crossed together, not into a home, but into eternity. Their story is the quiet, subversive counter, minus narrative to all the grand histories. It whispers that while empires are built on laws and legions, they are lived in the hearts of bakers' sons and the hopes of girls with saffron veils. Sometimes, the most powerful act in all of Rome's long, violent, magnificent history was not the signing of a treaty or the winning of a battle. It was the simple, unbearable act of staying.